And welcome to Access Chat. We have a plethora of guests today, including one that you might recognize from previous episodes. Welcome back to Gareth Ford-Williams, who is in charge of accessibility at the BBC still after all of this time, and was our first ever guest on Access Chat. So welcome back, Gareth. We've also got Bruno Maag and David Bailey joining us, and today's topic is one that I'm particularly interested in, which is around making fonts and typefaces accessible. So if you would care to introduce yourselves. Gareth, do you want to start if I've done you an injustice in my introduction?
No, this is a good introduction. So pretty much covers everything. So I'm now, my title I think has changed. This is the third time I'm on, and probably the third job title. But still running the accessibility team. So now head of design / accessibility, and I'm also running the assistive technology team in the BBC as well. I mean, this is a topic that's also, I've been massively interested in for a long time, dabbled in the past, and then had the fortune of meeting Bruno and David, and now got really sucked into the subject in a big way, but I'll let them, sort of explain why.
Excellent. So, Bruno, do you want to tell us a bit about your background, please?
Yes. I am the chairman and founder of Maag, which is a type foundry based in London. We've been going for nearly 31 years now. So, no, what am I talking about? 29 years, apologies. 29 years. And we make fonts, primarily custom fonts. So some of the work we have done is obviously with the BBC Reese typefaces, but we've also worked with Amazon, Netflix, Airbnb, like primarily the large tech corporates, but we also do smaller projects, and of course with the big companies, accessibility is always kind of, it's one of the baseline requirements, obviously, and particularly if you work in a digital environment, you have to have accessibility, you have to have typefaces that actually function within a UI environment, and beyond that, of course, as well, because they have to be in print as well. About 6 years ago or so, 7 years ago, I got much more involved and interested in the accessibility side of it, and started getting involved into neuroscience. My wife is a neuroscientist, and together with her, we used to have like 2 o'clock in the morning Prosecco-fueled conversations about typeface designs and neuroscience. And then we started realizing that there's a big overlap there as well. So much so that I did a lot of background reading, and also in particular with the subject of dyslexia, and trying to dispel some myths, and in doing so, dispelling the myths, obviously upsetting a lot of people as well, because people can't cope with home truths. And and that's sort of like how I really got into the whole accessibility side, and having all that knowledge of the neuroscience now really informs how we design as well. It's kind of like we make the decisions much more consciously, rather than just intuitively. If we make a decision about a design or the letter spacing, we know why it is, and we can argue it as well. So that's briefly about me.
David.
Hi, folks. So I'm David Bailey. I'm user experience principal for visual design and branding at the BBC. My role is to sort of help drive consistent, high quality design and brand experience across our entire online output. Prior to that, I've been with the BBC for about 6 years now. But prior to the role I'm in currently, I was creative director of our global experience language, which is our shared design framework, and accessibility is baked into everything that we do, all of our output in our department. So I was really involved in evolving that design framework for the organisation in all the right ways. And then prior to that, I spent sort of about 16 years working in commercial sector. I used to work with a very famous design studio called the Designers Republic, who were kind of a sort of cutting edge design studio in the 90s and the 2000s. And then I ran my own studio Kiosk, which did much more of the same. So lots of art direction, traditional graphic design and branding for the music industry, arts, fashion, film, TV, media, all sorts of good stuff. So coming to the BBC, I've been on a huge learning curve, and now I'm kind of this hybrid of sort of brand design specialist as well as UX design framework thinking, design system thinking specialist as well, combined into this principal role. So, and I love it. Well done.
Excellent. So that's great. And if people are wondering why Debra's disappeared, she lives in rural Virginia and has the worst internet in the developed world. She will be back shortly. But so if I go to Gareth, what was it that prompted you to start doing the work on developing dyslexia, particularly dyslexia accessible fonts? I know that you'd done work before the development of Rugh, but you developed this typeface and font Rugh.
Well, it was a,
and
it
what
was
was
a funny
it that
one.
prompted it?
Well, it was. I mean, obviously, I'm dyslexic myself, and it was something that I'd been interested in, but I couldn't find a huge amount of really, sort of good, conclusive, hard evidence out there. And this goes back to my time when I was at UView, when I was on secondment to UView for 2 years for the part of the team that designed and built the interface and the hardware behind it. And one of the things we were looking at was the UI typeface, and I went out looking for stuff, and I could find a lot of claims, and I could find a lot of people talking about it, and I couldn't find a huge amount of evidence.
Yeah.
Admittedly, I probably didn't look deep enough, particularly into the neuroscientific side, and until I met Bruno, I wasn't prompted into start looking in that area. It was like, where do you start? But I always felt like this was one of those foundation things that was missing in the world of accessibility. People talk a lot about typography, or at least, the presentation of type, but what about the actual typeface itself? And there was, there's lots of spurious claims about the Comic Sans, claims that are out there, but I can never find anything. It all seemed to be anecdote. That's an anecdote. Anecdote is always interesting because it helps you raise questions and actually explore whether there are research questions, but actually evidence was massively missing. And so we did the best we could when I was at UView, and then really it was actually it's a question that's probably aimed at probably David to start off with, because David started, or was really right, the starting point of this whole idea of the BBC having a single typeface. And that's when the conversation started, and then we started working with Alton Maag. But David can give you some of that kind of history, and I just got sucked into this because I thought I was never able to actually find the answers, find the things that I wanted. When I worked at UView, we did the best we could, and we made quite a good decision, I think, in the end. But it always felt like there was so much more to this and so much missing in opportunity. So I don't know, David, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to tell you a bit about that. So when I joined the BBC, as I said before, I joined as creative director of our design framework, the global experience language. And I saw my remit was to kind of raise the profile of that and make it more buy into it, more belief in it as our design system that all our designers could get behind and develop as a group. But I was also looking for ways to kind of evolve its visual styling and its personality and presence, and a core element of any kind of brand or brand system or visual design system is a typeface. And the typefaces that our design system was using was Helvetica, which is a system typeface, a grotesque typeface designed 100 years ago for print, and somewhat invisible. And you could argue that it being invisible is a good thing for a public service organization that has to be sort of neutral in its political opinion, etc. It kind of suits that in some respects because it's somewhat neutral. It's just pure information. Sorry.
For some of our audience that are not so knowledgeable about typefaces, can you explain the difference between grotesque typefaces?
You want me to do that, David, or do you want?
I don't mind. I mean, I can give the very quick version of it, and you could maybe fill in if I've got anything wrong. But very broadly speaking, a grotesque typeface has more sort of equal proportions and is more sort of, it's designed around its delivery of information. It doesn't have any kind of flair or flow. It's very much, it's just, actually, Bruno probably would be better at describing this.
Yeah. Basically, in a grotesque typefaces, the impression you get is that they are constructed, almost mechanical typefaces. So you will find that the character widths tend to be very even, pretty much the same from one character to another. For example, if you think of the lower cases, think of the A, the B, the C, the E, etc. You know, they all pretty much sit on the same width. Also, the characters tend to look very closed in. Again, if you think of the C, for example, you find that the jaws are really coming close together. So that, of course, creates a degree of ambiguity as well.
Yes.
Grotesque typefaces are, for example, like Arial, Helvetica, Accidents Grotesque is another one, Universe is another one. So these are the more famous ones. But I say the basic principle is relatively high X height, relatively short ascender and descender. So the descender is the bit that sticks down below, like in the P or in the G. The ascender is the bit that sticks up, like the H or the F, for example. So they tend to be quite short as well, which then also gives you quite dense impression when you typeset it, when you look at it in composition as well. As opposed to that, you have humanist typefaces, and we're talking about sans serifs now. You have humanist typefaces, which have more varied proportion, and by and large, the character shapes tend to be open. Again, if you think of the lowercase c or the cap C, it has open jaws, you know, and that creates much more variety within the individual shapes as well. Also, humanist typefaces tend to have a more relaxed letter spacing than grotesque, which tend to be quite tightly spaced as well. So that's basically the two kind of like signifiers between those two main kind of like stylistic features of sans serifs. So over to David.
Yeah, thanks, Bruno. So, and I think designers, graphic designers, really like grotesque typefaces because they have a kind of a modern flavor. And I think that's probably born out of all the corporate identities in science fiction films and road signage and things that people see in the world and feel kind of like systemizey and neutral. And I think designers go towards that because it feels like a safe bet and it has a modern flavor. So because of that, you see a hell of a lot of Helvetica, which is a very famous grotesque typeface. You see a lot of it in the world. And I think that so that was the typeface that Joel was using, and it was fine, but we felt that but we knew that there were some accessibility concerns with it because of some of the things that Bruno just said about there being quite close proportions. It's difficult for the eye to saccadically scan the words and get through it very quickly. So depending on your ability, your ability with reading or whatever, it could kind of harm your sort of experience or slow you down somewhat. So that was one hook that I saw. And it will help solve that problem. So that's great because accessibility runs through everything the BBC does. And am I cutting out, folks? Can you still hear me?
You did for briefly, but you're back now.
Yeah. So my selfish interest was introduce a new typeface, but accessibility, if we could fix some accessibility issues, then that would be a really good driver for me to sort of take this to the business and say, we need this typeface, not because we want to look new and modern and all of those things, but for these reasons. And this was one of them: accessibility, legibility, readability of typefaces on small screens or whatever the future holds, you know. And so there was that issue. There was also cost saving. If we introduced a new typeface and we owned it, then we could stop paying these licenses on all these other typefaces that we were using. And we could bring about a more distinctive typographic tone of voice to the organization. So they were the three things: cost saving, legibility, and distinctiveness. And that's what really helped drive this kind of through and help it become a success and get done. So really, it took quite a long time to get that across the line for me, because I was having to argue this, and people had tried to done it. My predecessors had tried to introduce typefaces in the past to the BBC and failed. And I was kind of doggedly like pursuing this because I saw a real kind of opportunity for us. And finally, it got signed off after a lot of wearing out of the shoe leather, moving around the business, interacting with lots of stakeholders and showing them the proof of why we needed it. And it went through, and that's when really we put the call out to a number of different type design agencies, of which Bruno's company, Maag, were one. And they responded with a fantastic pitch essentially for the job, which really just demonstrated their ability at creating really beautifully distinctive typefaces, but also their fascination and high interest in accessibility and reading. And so they felt like, and they'd done it for large media organizations before, so we knew we were in good hands.
Okay.
And so that was the beginning of our education as a design team at the BBC, which is hundreds of people. We built a group of ambassadors for this project and took them off to Bruno's studio in South London to begin our education. And that's where Gareth and me started to learn so much. And it was quite wonderful, really. So I think that's where this started. This is where the inception of this. And now we get to kind of the design of a typeface, which is where I think Bruno maybe should take over. Or Neil,
and I want to jump in a little bit just before, which was to say, obviously there were people out there touting that they'd created accessible fonts, particular things like dyslexia, read regular, open dyslexic.
There's been quite a spate, and there's FSB
Indeed.
and things that came out, and obviously Comic Sans has had this sort of notion behind it that it's an accessible typeface, and but it's always been a problem with those things. And to try and understand what it was, because Tiresias is another one, which is the European broadcast font, which is probably the oldest of the accessible typefaces. And you start to look at the research, because if someone's making a claim like this, you want to know that there's some really hard and fast evidence that has informed the design.
Yes.
And we couldn't find that in those things. I mean, there may be some good stuff within there, but it always seemed to be that the evidence came after the production, rather than, it felt the wrong way around. So, or it was anecdotal, or in the case of Tiresias, it was just the wrong methodology for researching type in the first place. I mean, it was a screen typeface, so they tested it on paper and point size against the CFAX font and Times New Roman. It was the methodology just fell apart when you looked at it and go, we can't actually take anything from this claim behind Tiresias, and we struggled to find much more than anecdote to back anything else up, and some of the anecdote is quite strong, but it kind of, to understand what's going in there, I think it's with open dyslexia. That's an interesting one. It's just a bigger typeface anyway. And one of those things, if you run everything in point size and measure one against the other, and people will always pick the bigger one. It doesn't mean you just make the other one larger, and then they have got no idea which one to pick. It's just a bigger typeface. That does not make it more readable or legible necessarily. There may be features, there may be stuff in there, but we just couldn't draw that out. So the idea was, we need to do this from scratch, and this is why, finding a partner like Bruno to work on this, that had already, you'd already been exploring this with Amazon and other organizations as well, with your work on Bookily, and it was to start drawing out some of that stuff of, actually, no, there are things in here that are, enable performance. They enable people to read and get a flow in reading. There is stuff around, for some people it's character recognition, for some people they need to recognize words, and for other people there's this saccadic flow of words, which Bruno needs to explain it way better than I can. But it was just understanding that science of reading and the different ways people do, and then work back from that and saying, okay, what does it need to do? What are those features that support that? And those are those kind of baseline things we need to start building from, rather than have a hypothesis, design a font, and then try and, test it or prove it afterwards, which is what I felt, which obviously, is what we felt was happening in that world of accessible type.
There's one thing I would say. So, with another thing to say is that So there were accessible typefaces, as Gareth's saying, but we would have had to have licensed them. So to own it was the more cost-effective solution. But equally, it gave us the opportunity to be best in class and create. What would the BBC do if it was to create a typeface? Well, it would have to create something that was really, truly, best in class, and that's what we set out to do. What was so lovely about this learning process that we went through from Bruno was you got all these people in the organization who had no interest in typefaces whatsoever. The business analysts, technical architects, God knows, right? We took them on this journey, and they all became incredibly nerdy very quickly about typeface design. Now, once that happens, once you learn a thing or two, you like to share it, don't you? You like to share it with your friends and your colleagues. And so they started doing that. So we quickly built this kind of ambassadorship with these people who poured out this information to their respective flocks, so to speak. And then there was this movement that started to build in the BBC around us making, a best-in-class typeface. So I didn't set out for that to happen, but that's what happened, and we capitalized on it when we saw it happening. It's a very good learning for business, this one.
Debra, you have a comment?
I know, and I've been very quiet, but the reason why I've been quiet, and first of all, I apologize that my Wi-Fi kicked me off, but rural America, we need better connectivity. But I am so fascinated by this because you're bringing up things that, as you were saying, David, people would start learning this and realize how powerful this is. And I had no idea people like Bruno were doing these things, but it is so fascinating. It really is fascinating. And what I would wonder is, well, kudos to BBC for working with Bruno's team to figure this out. And I hear all the things you're saying, but then I also wonder, it sounds like you really have come up with a best in typeface. So is this something that you can help others do? I'm not going to ask a lot of questions, I bet, on this episode, because this is something I haven't delved into this, but I'm fascinated with the neuroscience of it. And just as somebody that, as I've gotten older, I struggle to, I have a problem. I'm on the computer all day long, but I don't read anymore. What I do is I either have Alexa read Kindle to me, or I do, I let them read it to me, and I absorb the information better because I recently was diagnosed with dyslexia. I already have ADHD, and I'm starting to think those two things are common together. But I'm fascinated by what you're saying, because I have a daughter with Down syndrome, and then of course sadly is my husband. His dementia increased, his reading ability really was impacted. So this impacts so many people, but I don't hear anybody talking about this. So I just want to say I'm fascinated. I'm just curious at some point when it makes sense in the conversation to, how can everybody else learn from what BBC is doing? And I know that's partially why we're here. And I'm going to go on mute. Go ahead, Bruno.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that. First, Debra, I'd like to encourage you to start reading more again, because reading, like everything, like playing an instrument, is something that you get better at with practice.
Yeah, I have something that's called dry eye, so my eyes burn all the time.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, obviously, I do appreciate, like people have, a variety of afflictions or, deficiencies and so on and so forth. I appreciate that. But I think first and foremost, we all need to understand that we are not born with the ability to read.
Okay.
We are not born with that. We have to learn it, and we have to practice it. There's a tiny little bit in your brain. In the vast majority of the world's population, it's on your left hemisphere, just sort of like behind the top part of your ear, and it's the size of the top of your fingertip, and it's called the visual word form area. In there, every single character of any language, irrespective of writing system, is being decoded. But you have to train that part of the brain. You have to train the neurons to recognize the shapes that it is presented with, so it can decode them correctly. Right?
So Bruno, so, and I totally interrupted you, I apologize, because I think I could just sit at your feet and listen to you for weeks on end, because you're so brilliant. But But are you saying, because I've never thought about it from this perspective, are you saying that, because I mean, I do work all day long, I do PowerPoint presentations, but do you also, to make sure that you don't lose almost that muscle, we still, even if it's hurt, that's fascinating. Okay, I'm learning. Thank you.
You see,
Yes.
in order to understand reading, you need to understand neuroscience. And the brain is always at full capacity, right? Every single bit, every single neuron in your brain is used, not always at the same time, but every single neuron has a specific function. This whole thing of people saying, oh, we only use 10% of our brain. I mean, it's complete and utter rubbish. Our brain is used 100%, for different things. If it were doing a 100% at full speed all the time, simultaneously, within about 3 days, you'd be dead of exhaustion, because the brain would use up so many calories, so much energy, you couldn't actually eat that much. It's impossible, But anyways, so, and the brain has to do so much, so that there is a concept in neuroscience called neurological recycling. So that basically the brain takes neurons that are lying dormant, that are not being used, and it takes them and uses it for something else, for a new skill, say, for example. And once that's gone, it's gone. It's really, really hard to then grab those neurons back and reutilize them for what you had done previously. The same goes with your visual word form area. First of all, the less you read, the less you train, the less that area is able to efficiently and quickly and correctly identify and decode the shapes of letters, and the more the brain will be tempted to start doing neural recycling, because you're not using it. So therefore, hey, I'm going to take that. You're not making use of it. I'm going to take it. Your loss, not my problem. So you got to do that. So that particular part. Now, of course, with the whole reading, you then also have the semantic area, which sits sort of like at the front, near the frontal lobe, where meaning is attached to letters and to letter shapes and to words, etc. And in the reading process is also involved the phonological area, which is also in your left hemisphere, which sits in your primary auditory cortex, very close to the visual word form area, where sound is attached to a visual shape in order to correctly eventually identify what the written word means. Because that's also a little bit dependent on language. Certain languages are opaque, certain languages are transparent. English is a very opaque language where basically nothing sounds like it spells and nothing means what it's written at, etc., which makes it even harder for dyslexics and so on and so forth. But that's like another 3-hour episode of Fax Chat, So, but that's just your neural recycling, and I know I kind of like hijacked, the whole conversation. In your brain, and I think that's extremely important to understand as well. Yes, obviously you can have a deficiency in your eyes, which then of course affects what's being sent back into your visual cortex and eventually into your visual word form area. And if you have a blurred image of a character, then the visual word form area has much more difficulty to correctly identify what the shape is, and therefore your reading speed goes down, the legibility goes down, and so etc. If the reading speed and the reading flow is interrupted and affected, then of course your comprehension is going to be affected as well. So it has a huge amount of repercussions. So now we're going outside of the eyes, and we're going into the actual character shapes. So the more ambiguous the character shapes and the more complex the character shapes, the harder it is for the visual word form area to correctly identify what the letter shapes are, right? So this is why, for example, something like Helvetica, a grotesque typeface, is probably, or is less legible than a humanist typeface, because a grotesque typeface has far more ambiguity. So your brain has to do much more work to correctly and quickly decode the letter shapes. So now I'm exhausted.
No, that's okay. So we need
Yeah,
to
but
feed you,
wow,
obviously.
wow.
That still is only scratching the surface, believe
Yeah.
me. We've been talking about this stuff for over, what, 3 years?
Yeah.
It's like, and we're still unpicking some of this stuff. And then
It's
you get into,
very important, very
yeah,
important.
it is. And you get into the, which is why we've got, you know, a serif and a sans serif version of Wreath, because, you know, you've got with the sans version, it's really good for individual character recognition, and the serif font is really good for word, because serifs that we learned through this pull the word together as a shape. So if you're a person who really needs whole words and to get that flow through, it's right, isn't it, Bruno? You know, the serifs actually are an aid.
They are an aid.
Readability.
Exactly, they are an aid because they disambiguate individual shapes even more. Say, for example, if you have mirror characters like a B and a D, or a P and a Q, you know, with the serifs, you can actually create extra visual cues as to indicate what shape it is.
Which
so that,
I like. I like when they do that. It helps my brain, like the 7 or the 1.
Yeah, exactly. You know, that also brings me. Go on.
We built some of those characteristics into BBC Wreath deliberately as a kind of a design feature as well. Maybe you were about to say that, Bruno. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for example, like if you look at the P and the Q, for example, the Q hasn't got a spur at the top, you know, where the curve goes into the straight. Quite often you find that there's a little spur sticking out. The Q in BBC Wreath goes sort of like curves in at an angle. And then you have the P, but the P does have a spur, you know. So again, that's a differentiation between two shapes, and that's a cue as to how your brain ought to kind of like decode the characters.
It's giving your brain clues and help and assistance with all of this kind of stuff. And
exactly.
when we started unpacking this, you know, I think the arguments often get way oversimplified. You know, there was the poll I saw recently that said serif versus sans serif, and it's like, but there are hundreds of each one, and there are so many different classifications and all those other features, and you can't unpick them and say, is one set of features better? It's a holistic approach, and each one of those has a job to do. And you know, it's and there are so many features as well. When you start, there are some very generalistic ones which we touched on.
So I'm interested in that because you can talk about serif versus sans serif, but weight of font also has a significant impact on legibility. You know, for example, we talked about Helvetica before. Well, when Apple went from Helvetica to Helvetica New, they made it much more skinny. And for me, that was a real problem, because then I suddenly found it much harder to read anything on my iPhone. So it's not that there were still sans serif fonts, but it was just a lot harder for me to read because it became,
you know, I mean, let's face it, you know, there is a reason why a regular typeface, you know, or what you would call a regular, you know, why the stems, you know, the vertical strokes, and by and large, you know, a little bit thinner, the horizontal strokes, why they have a certain weight. You know, this has been tried and tested for the last 500 years or 550 years, since Gutenberg basically invented printing with movable type. It's not changed. There is a reason for it, you know. So there's no point for digital designers, you know, in UI environment to start going thin, you know, when a large part of the audience, you know, tends to be over 40, whose eyesight is going to pots, basically, you know, and that's a natural deterioration of our eyesight. You know, old people see less, and that's a fact. You know, so therefore you have to tell those 20-year-old kids with 20/20 vision to actually start thinking with people a 50-year-old in mind. You know, like myself. you know. But anyway, one of the things also, going quickly back to the neuroscience as well, of course, short-term memory plays a very important role as well, you know, in the processing. And it has been shown that people who have short-term memory afflictions, you know, find it much harder to read as well. So it's kind of like, you know, the quick process that I illustrate. It's obviously very, very simplified. Processes are extremely complex in the brain. You have short-term memory involved. You have the visual word form area involved, the semantic area. You have the phonological area involved. On top of that, you also have the entire motor cortex involved, you know, which obviously controls your eye movement, so you can do your saccadic movements across the line. And so basically the brain controlling your eyes to know what you're looking at. You have the visual cortex involved. You have the auditory cortex involved. There's two areas called, I always confuse them, Wernicke and Broca. One of them is language input. The other one is language output. You know, so it's a continuous feedback loop when you read, and particularly when you start reading out loud. It's a continuous feedback loop that basically is so complex that is really, really, really hard to describe it, you know, because everything is involved, literally everything. And then of course you have numbers. Numbers is a completely different matter, because numbers don't get processed in the visual word form area, they get processed in the visual number form area, exactly in the opposite side of the brain, in your arithmetic hemisphere. Basically, the left-hand side is primarily linguistic functions, the right-hand side is primarily arithmetic functions. And then there's the cross-informational thing between the two hemispheres, you know, that eventually brings it all together. Okay, someone else talk. I'm running out of...
No, that's good. So,
but it's amazing. Wow.
Yeah. And we're also, you know, buffering up on the edge of our time. But this is such a fascinating topic that I think that people will be happy for us to run over. I think that the other thing I just wanted to touch on before we close was we've also not touched upon the sort of the desire to produce something that looks nice and the desire for something that is aesthetically pleasing, because one of the objections that I have to some of the previous accessible fonts were that they were ugly, and that they were aesthetically displeasing to me, to the point where I found that it was off-putting reading. So I mean, how much
is it? But Neil, is it ugly, or is it going back to the science? I would be curious. Is it going back to the science that Bruno was saying? Maybe your brain is saying it's ugly because of.
Well, so they're deliberately unbalanced, right? Because they were designed to be unbalanced so that you could discern that letters were different. But I guess when we think of beauty, we think of symmetry and balance.
But it's also appropriateness. Yeah, I think there's
there's definitely a bit about appropriateness.
Yeah, and I think it's the famous one of when, you know, the scientists at CERN announced the Higgs boson. And they did their PowerPoint in Comic Sans, and there were more tweets on the day about the typeface than the greatest scientific discovery of our age. You know, it's because they made the whole thing look like a nursery newsletter, and that was inappropriate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, their studies going as far back as 1927 by Poffenberger and Franken, who were two psychologists, and they looked into the look and feel of typefaces. And they did a whole study, and they compared different stylistic expressions of typefaces, the look and feel, and had people match them to certain industries, and to, you know, primarily within an advertising context. And they found that the vast majority of people, irrespective of whether male or female, would place certain typefaces in certain categories, you know, pretty much unfailingly. you know. And so clearly we associate culturally, or maybe because of shape, etc., culturally, or maybe also natively, we associate certain shapes and certain types of letter forms with certain industry, with certain types of information and communication. Yeah.
Can I say, so bringing it back to Rugh for a second. So with Rugh, since the typeface had to be a representation of the BBC's tone of voice, it had to have a variety of styles and weights to be able to sort of echo something of the different types of content that we're publishing, but equally something of a reflection of society as well. There had to be different kinds of tones of voice or accents, so to speak, in our typographic presentation. So that's why we developed quite a large font family for BBC Rugh. But back to what you were saying, Neil, before about it actually looking nice and feeling like the right thing, the right typeface, or being desirable. I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot between Gareth, myself, and Bruno is about the 3 pillars of accessibility. So there's technical, you know, is it built correctly? Is it functional? Does it work? And emotional accessibility, does it appeal?
Yes.
And I think if you don't have that initially, then they're not going to care if it works or functions, because they're not going to look at it. So that's a huge part of accessibility as well.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to see those 3 points, you know, emotional, functional, and technical, as a holistic triangle. You know, none can work in isolation. They always harmonize together. And if you get the sweet spot, then you have the most optimal typeface. You know, I'm not saying the perfect, but I say the most optimal, because perfection doesn't exist.
No, and I always remember my days back at UV was talking to a group of teenagers and we were talking about their assistive tech, and some of them had a lot of stuff attached to their chairs. They had their PCs and various input devices and technologies. And I remember the general mood was a lot of them really hated them because they made them, they're teenagers. They're self-conscious. They're going through what every teenager does. They want cool stuff. And yet it all looks like it was designed by Fisher-Price. And they absolutely hated their kit. And they wanted something that looked cool and sophisticated and, you know, and functional, and so that it felt it said something, it reflected something about themselves and the way they wanted to feel about themselves. And to have something that looked like it was out of a book for a 5-year-old, for a 17-year-old is humiliating.
Yes.
And so, you know, we have to have that connection, and we have to feel comfortable. And as Neil said, some of those typefaces, they look like they've come from Scooby-Doo, or, you know, or the Goodies or something. That's a UK reference, by the way, Debra, you won't get. But it's that, you know, they just don't look, they're wrong, they're out of place. And it becomes difficult. There may be some good stuff in there.
Yeah. But it's incongruous. It feels incongruous. We've definitely run over now, so I do need to thank My Clear Text for keeping us captioned, Barclays Access for supporting us over the years, and Microlink also. So it only remains to thank Bruno, David, and Gareth for what has been a fascinating chat today. I'm really looking forward to the conversations on Twitter on Tuesday. Thank you very much.
And thank you, BBC, for continuing to really raise the bar for everybody. I'm asked all the time in the US, who's the best? And I say, BBC. I tell people that all the time. And obviously, because you're working with people like Bruno, so applause.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.